The fluorescent light above the greeting card aisle was half dead, stuttering in a slow, rhythmic pulse that made Zara's splitting headache feel like something with teeth. She was sitting on the floor between the card display and the bottom shelf of the vitamin aisle, her back against the cold metal rack, her right wrist cradled against her chest. The skin around the joint had gone the color of a bruised plum in the 20 minutes since the man in the grey jacket had grabbed her and thrown her into the kitchen counter. The pharmacist, an older woman named Bev, who'd been locking up when Zara came stumbling through the parking lot, had let her in and turned the deadbolt behind them without asking a single question. She'd handed Zara a bag of frozen peas from the break room mini-fridge and pointed at the floor. "Stay down until I tell you otherwise," Bev had said. That was 14 minutes ago. Outside, through the smoked security glass of the front window, Zara could see the parking lot. 2 cars she didn't recognize had pulled in and idled there for 7 minutes before leaving. She'd counted the seconds. Craig was not coming back. She knew that the same way she knew the bones in her wrist were probably cracked and not just sprained, with a bone-deep physical certainty that her body accepted before her mind had finished arguing. He had run. He'd grabbed his laptop bag from behind the couch, while the man in the grey jacket was still yelling at Zara to produce proof of Craig's whereabouts, and he had gone out the building's back stairwell. She'd heard the fire door bang. She'd heard him leave her there. She pressed the frozen peas harder against her wrist and thought about the logistics of her situation the way she always thought about problems, like a ledger. Assets on one side, liabilities on the other. Assets. The pharmacy was locked. Bev was willing to give her 5 minutes before calling the police. Liabilities. She could not talk to the police. Her name was on 3 fraudulent loan applications Craig had filed with a private lender 6 weeks ago. She knew this because the man in the grey jacket had told her, calmly, with her hair in his fist, that Zara Benn was now $90,000 in debt to Desmond Garrow, and that was just the principal. Liabilities. She had no purse, no phone, no ID. Craig had grabbed the purse on his way out the back. She didn't know if that was deliberate or just reflex. She suspected deliberate. Assets. She remembered a phone number. She hadn't dialed it in 7 years. She hadn't said the name attached to it out loud in longer than that. She had spent 7 years building a life in Charlotte, specifically, so that name would never have a reason to surface. A bookkeeping job, a small apartment, a dental practice chain that paid her on time, and never asked questions about the 3-year gap in her resume. She had made herself unremarkable. She had made herself safe. Craig had dismantled SAFE in approximately 8 months, and done it with her own social security number. Bev came around the corner of the aisle, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. "There's a courtesy phone in the back," she said quietly. "Line 2's active. Make it fast." Zara stood up. The pharmacy's stockroom smelled like industrial cleaner and cardboard. The phone was a battered landline mounted on the cinder block wall next to the schedule board. Zara picked up the receiver. The dial tone hummed. She stood there for a long moment. Calling this number was not a decision. It was a failure, the collapse of everything she'd built out of sheer, grinding determination to be ordinary. It was admitting that her father's world had a longer reach than she'd given it credit for, that you couldn't scrub a history clean just by moving 5 states away and learning how to do payroll. She dialed. It rang once. It rang twice. On the 3rd ring, the line opened. No greeting, just the particular quality of silence that belongs to someone who is listening very carefully. She said his name, Roman Riordan. A pause, not surprise, assessment. Then a voice she hadn't heard in 7 years, low and measured and entirely devoid of warmth. "Tell me who put their hands on you." She hadn't said she was hurt. She hadn't said anything except his name. Her throat closed briefly. "How did you?" "You're breathing. Talk." Roman Riordan's office occupied the top floor of a building on the waterfront that looked, from the outside, like a holding company for maritime insurance. The sign by the elevator said Coastal Risk Partners. The men in the lobby looked like maritime insurance men. The man behind the walnut desk at 11:40 p.m., staring at a ledger by the light of a single lamp, did not particularly look like anything at all. That was the point. He was 43 years old, and he had spent the better part of 2 decades making himself into a thing that was difficult to categorize. He wore charcoal and dark slate, and the occasional navy, all of it expensive, none of it flashy. He had the kind of face that people forgot after looking directly at it, which had always struck him as the most useful feature a man in his position could possess. He was not forgettable in a room, but in a photograph, in a description, on a witness stand, very few people could actually pin down what Roman Riordan looked like. The scar running from his left jaw to just below his ear helped in a strange way. People focused on it and missed the eyes, which was fine. The eyes were where everything was. At 11:40, the phone on the bottom left side of his desk rang. This phone had rung 4 times in 7 years. The first 3 had been wrong numbers, which he'd found almost funny. This time he answered before the second ring was finished. He did not speak, he listened. 1 word. His name in a voice he would have recognized at the bottom of a harbor. He thought, there it is. He stood up before she'd finished her second sentence. By the time she'd confirmed the address, he was already reaching for his jacket. His enforcer, a man named Pio, who had been with him for 11 years and who communicated almost entirely in small gestures and significant silences, appeared in the doorway. Riordan said, "Garrow's crew, pharmacy on Meridian and 7th, bring the sedan." Pio's chin dropped a fraction of an inch. He turned. "One more thing." Riordan buttoned his jacket. "Find out who filed loan applications under the name Zara Benn in the last 90 days. I want the applicant's name on my phone before we reach the building." Pio left. Riordan walked to the elevator. The city blurred past the car windows in ribbons of amber and white, rain beginning to collect on the glass. He looked at his phone. Pio's message came through in 4 minutes. The applicant's name was Craig Navarro. He read it twice, put the phone in his jacket pocket. Looked at the city. Bev unlocked the front door when the black sedan pulled up outside. She'd taken one look at the man getting out of it, the set of his shoulders, the way the rain didn't seem to bother him, the other man a half step behind with his hands loose at his sides, and said to Zara, "Those your people?" Zara had said yes before she'd thought about whether it was true. Riordan came through the door, and his eyes found her immediately, in the vitamin aisle, still holding the bag of frozen peas. He crossed the distance without hurrying. He crouched in front of her the way you'd crouch in front of something fragile, a wounded animal, a piece of evidence you couldn't afford to disturb. He looked at her wrist first, then her face, then the door. "The 2 cars that were in the lot," he said. "They left about 20 minutes ago." "They didn't leave. They're parked on the service road behind the building." His voice hadn't changed in 7 years. Still that same level, colorless register like he was discussing a budget line item. "Garrow doesn't commit 2 men to a parking lot and then go home. He's waiting for you to surface." The frozen peas were leaking onto her fingers. She hadn't noticed. "How do you know it's Garrow?" "Because your fiancé borrowed $90,000 from a lender Garrow uses as a front, put your name on the paperwork as co-signer, and then used the money to cover losses from a futures scheme that went sideways in March. He said it the way you read a balance sheet. Fact, fact, fact. He's been rolling the debt for 3 months. 2 weeks ago, Garrow's people cornered him in a parking garage and told him they needed collateral. He suggested you." The stockroom phone was still warm in her palm. She looked at him. "He suggested me." "He told them you had a connection to the Chicago Syndicate, that your father ran numbers for 12 years, which means you have value above and beyond $90,000. Riordan tilted his head, fractionally. "He offered to deliver you. Tonight was the delivery." The bag of frozen peas hit the linoleum. Zara sat very still. 7 years ago, she had stood in the middle of Roman Riordan's office, Younger, angrier, more frightened than she'd ever admitted, and told him she was leaving. She'd said, "I'm not my father's daughter. I'm not built for this. I want a life where no one knows my name and nothing bleeds." She'd expected him to argue. He hadn't. He'd given her a number written on a slip of paper. For emergencies, he'd said, the word carrying enough weight that she'd understood he meant catastrophic ones, and he'd let her walk out. She had found catastrophic. She had found it in the form of a man who wore khakis and had strong opinions about craft beer, and who had been quietly using her identity as collateral debt for 8 months. "Can you walk?" Riordan asked. "Yes." He stood, reached into his jacket and produced a folded handkerchief, which he placed over her wrist like a compress, his hands careful around the swelling. The gesture was businesslike, not tender, but careful. "We're leaving through the front. Pio's going to handle the service road. You walk directly to the car. You don't stop. You don't look at the service road." She looked at Bev, who was standing at the end of the aisle with her arms folded, and the expression of a woman who had made a decision to not know things. "Thank you," Zara said. Bev said, "Ice that wrist," and walked back toward the pharmacy counter. The front door opened. The rain hit Zara's face. She walked to the car. Behind her, somewhere in the dark geometry of the service road, she heard nothing at all, and somehow that was worse than a sound. The building Riordan took her to was not the waterfront office. It was a residential tower in the financial district. 32 floors, the lobby marble and brass, and the kind of quiet that expensive buildings maintain like a policy. A private physician was waiting in the living room of the upper floor apartment when they arrived. A compact woman in her 60s named Dr. Cassell, who examined Zara's wrist with brisk efficiency and announced a hairline fracture of the scaphoid, fitted her with a splint, handed her 2 ibuprofen and a glass of water, and was gone in under 25 minutes. Zara sat on a low grey sofa in a room that contained almost no personal items and drank the water. Riordan stood at the window, jacket gone, sleeves rolled back, the dark ink of a tattoo visible on his left forearm. He was reading something on his phone. He didn't pace. He didn't check on her. He simply existed in the room the way a weight exists, permanently, without requiring acknowledgement. She said, "Did you know? When I called. Had you already pulled his file?" "I pulled it while the car was moving." He didn't look up from the phone. "How long have you been watching?" A pause. 3 years. She absorbed that 3 years. "Your father died 2 years ago. I thought you should know in case you wanted to." He stopped. Set the phone down on the windowsill. "You didn't come back for the funeral, which I understood, but it left you more visible than you realized. People started asking whether you existed. People with interests that weren't friendly. So you watched." "I watched. I ran background checks on anyone you had sustained contact with. Your employer, your landlord, him. You ran a check on Craig. The first time you had dinner with him twice in 1 week." His voice didn't change. "His finances were clean then. He didn't develop the gambling problem until 18 months in. By the time the debt was significant, you'd already filed for a joint bank account." Zara laughed, which surprised both of them. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the sound a thing makes when it finally breaks all the way through. "You watched him build the trap and you didn't." "I notified you. Twice." He met her eyes. "Your new number. I left messages identifying the caller as a risk management service with a flag on your credit report. You blocked the number." She remembered that. A robocall, she'd thought. Craig had said she was paranoid when she'd mentioned it. Craig had said a lot of things. "Where is he now?" she asked. "Extended stay hotel off I-85. He used a debit card at a gas station 40 minutes ago. We have the address." The "we" hung in the air. She thought about what we meant when Riordan used it, and decided not to examine it too closely. "What are you going to do to him?" she asked. He considered her for a moment. "Does it matter to you?" "Yes." She set the water glass down on the coffee table. "I'm not asking you to let him go. He sold me to cover a bet. I understand that the world doesn't offer him a handshake and a warning for that. She heard her own voice coming out harder than she expected, stripped of the softness she'd spent years cultivating. I'm asking whether what you do to him creates a debt I have to live with, whether it becomes something that follows me. Riordan said very quietly, "Everything follows you, Zara. That's what you didn't understand when you left." She looked at him. He said it without malice, without the satisfaction of being right. He said it the way you state a physical property of a thing. "Pay Garrow what Craig owed," she said. "Take it from Craig's accounts, whatever's left, then let Craig run. Men like him always do. They just keep running until they hit water and there's nowhere else to go. Let the geography handle it." The silence in the room stretched. "Garrow didn't lose money," Riordan said. "Garrow lost leverage. Craig walked into his operation, took a loan with your name attached to it. Your name specifically, because Craig told him you had Syndicate history, and then defaulted and ran. That's a public failure for Garrow. If I step in and pay it off, it signals that anyone connected to my network can fold on a debt, and I'll cover it." His voice hadn't risen. It never did. "I can't buy him immunity, Zara. The math doesn't work." She pressed her good hand flat on the cushion next to her. "Then what happens?" "What always happens." He picked his phone back up. "A liability gets removed from the ledger." Roman. It was the first time she'd used his given name. It stopped him the way almost nothing stopped him. A slight shift, like a gyroscope correcting. "If you do this, I can't pretend I didn't know what my presence in this city costs. I understand that. But I need to know I didn't bring a death into the world because I picked the wrong person to trust. That's the line I've been protecting for 7 years, and I need it to hold." He looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read his face, had never been able to, but she watched him work through something behind those unremarkable grey eyes. "Your line is already gone," he said. "It went the night he signed your name on someone else's debt." He turned toward the door. "But I hear you." He left. She sat in the silence and did not cry, because she'd learned a long time ago that crying was an indulgence and indulgences cost time, and time was the one currency she had never been able to accumulate. Pio appeared in the doorway sometime later and left a cup of tea on the coffee table without speaking, and that was almost worse than being alone. Craig was watching the parking lot from the curtain edge when the door opened. He'd bought a bottle of bourbon and drunk a third of it, and told himself that Garrow's people had probably given up, that Zara was probably fine, that he would call her in the morning and explain. He had a speech prepared. It involved the words "I panicked," and "I'm going to fix this," and "I love you," arranged in the order that sounded most plausible. Riordan came through the door, and the speech dissolved before Craig's mouth opened. He took a step back. His heel hit the bedside table. The lamp rattled. "Mister, I can explain. I have a plan. I'm going to pay it back. I just need—" "Tell me," Riordan said, closing the door behind him, "the exact moment you decided to put her name on the application." Craig swallowed. It wasn't. It was supposed to be temporary. The exact moment. The question wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It had the quality of a room with all the oxygen removed. Craig told him everything in about 4 minutes. How Garrow's man had cornered him in the parking garage. How they'd asked if he had anything of value. How he'd said the name, Zara Benn. Her father ran numbers. She's connected, because it was the only card he had left to play. How they'd told him that was interesting. How he'd gone home and cooked dinner and poured wine and sat across from Zara at the kitchen table and said nothing. Riordan stood very still while Craig spoke. When Craig finished, the silence was total. "She asked me not to do this," Riordan said. He sounded almost meditative. "She drew a line. I found that." He paused, notable. Craig said, "Please, I'll disappear. You'll never— Tell her I'm sorry, please." "She doesn't need your apology." Riordan turned toward the door. "She never needed anything from you. That's what you didn't understand." He reached for the handle. Pio moved past him into the room, and Riordan stepped out into the rain and pulled the door shut behind him. He stood there for exactly 3 seconds. The sound from inside the room was quiet, almost nothing, like a heavy book dropped on carpet. He walked to the car. Zara was in the kitchen of the apartment when he came back, standing at the counter with the splintered wrist held carefully at her side, drinking tea she'd reheated twice. The city outside the window had gone to that deep, specific grey that meant 3 in the morning. She looked at his hands first. They were in his pockets. "Did he say anything?" she asked. He was sorry. Riordan crossed the kitchen and poured 2 fingers of scotch from the bottle on the counter. He said it several times. "Okay," she set the mug down. "Okay." She didn't ask for more than that, and he didn't offer it. That was the thing about Riordan she'd forgotten while she was gone. How efficiently he could exist in silence, without making it feel cruel. Most people who didn't speak filled the space with their waiting. He simply occupied the room. "Garrow is going to come," she said. "He lost the leverage Craig promised him. He's going to want something to cover the embarrassment." "Yes." "Are you going to war over this?" He set the glass down. "I declared you under my protection the moment I answered that call. Everyone who needs to know, knows. Garrow isn't the type to assault a building he can't take. He'll hit peripheral operations. He'll try to cost me enough that settling becomes rational." He looked at her. "It won't work, but it will be loud for a while." She thought about her apartment in Charlotte, her desk at the dental practice, the carefully unremarkable life she'd constructed from years of conscious, deliberate boredom. "I can't go back," she said. "Not a question." "No. My job, my lease. I can have your personal items retrieved within 48 hours. Anything that matters." She thought about what actually mattered. The plants she'd forgotten to water, 3 books on her nightstand, a photograph of her mother she kept in the top dresser drawer, face down, because she couldn't decide whether grief was a thing you looked at or a thing you stored. "Not much," she admitted. Riordan said, "You're a good bookkeeper." She looked at him. "Better than good. You were running forensic audits on your father's ledgers at 15. You identified 3 skimming operations he didn't even know he had. He picked the glass back up. I have 4 accountants. None of them can do what you can do. You want to hire me. I want you to stop pretending you're ordinary. You're not. You were never going to be." He said it without apology, without anything that resembled sentiment. "You built a very convincing replica of a quiet life, and you lived in it for 7 years, and it still found you. Because this is what finds people like us. The only question is whether you're standing inside the machine or outside of it when it does." The kitchen was warm. Outside, the rain had started up again, that low, persistent drumming against the glass. She thought about Craig sitting across the dinner table with a glass of wine, knowing what he'd signed, knowing what he'd handed over. Refilling her glass and asking how her day was. She thought about 7 years of $12 lunches and regular payroll deposits, and the deliberate, effortful work of being no one. She thought about the fact that the first person she'd called, the only person she'd called, was the one man she'd specifically organized her entire adult life around never needing. "I don't want to want this," she said. "I know. I don't want to be back in it." "I know that too." He turned the glass in his hand. "You called me anyway." She had. At 11:40 p.m. from a pharmacy stockroom with a bag of frozen peas on her wrist, she had dialed his number, and he had answered before the second ring. And she had said his name, and he had said, "Tell me who put their hands on you," as if 7 years was a sentence he'd been waiting to finish. She looked at him across the kitchen. "What does being under your protection actually mean?" she asked. "I need to understand the terms." A very faint shift in his expression. Not quite a smile, something more controlled than that. "It means Garrow doesn't touch you. It means no one in this city does. It means you have resources, security, and information." He met her eyes. "It also means you're visible. People will know your connection to this operation. The ordinary life is no longer available. And in exchange? You work for me. You look at my books with those eyes of yours and you tell me what's wrong with them. I suspect there's quite a bit." He paused. "And you stop running. We can negotiate everything else." She was quiet for a long moment. "Garrow's going to make a move," she said finally. "Probably within 24 hours once he figures out Craig isn't coming back with me." "Yes. And when he does, you're going to need to know exactly where his operation is bleeding before he figures out where yours is." Riordan looked at her steadily. He didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. She understood what he was asking. She understood it was not a request. It was an offer. The only offer someone like her was going to receive tonight, or probably ever again. She said, "Show me the ledgers." For the first time in 7 years, something moved across Roman Riordan's face that wasn't calculation. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "In the morning," he said, "when the doctor confirms that wrist is stable." He left the kitchen. She heard him on the phone in the next room, his voice low and even, the particular cadence of a man reorganizing the moving pieces of a city around a new central fact. Zara turned back to the window. The rain was steady. The city hummed below, indifferent and enormous. She had spent 7 years trying to be no one. She had built the architecture of invisibility with a bookkeeper's precision, every detail considered, every connection severed, every trace of the girl who knew which numbers to look at and where the bodies were buried, filed away under a name she no longer answered to. It had taken Craig Navarro 8 months to hand her back to the dark. She picked up her tea. She thought about ledgers, real ones, with real numbers, where the losses were something she could actually locate and name and correct, where the damage was quantifiable, where you could look at a column and know exactly what had gone wrong and when. Desmond Garrow thought he held leverage over a woman he'd never met. By morning, he was going to find out he'd miscounted. Zara Benn had always been very good with numbers, and she was done pretending otherwise.